let's jump into the terminal and we can see what happens. Oh, wait, we had something happen, right? A user left our organization.
Yeah, and now we have to make sure user's access gets revoked, at least from a Linux side, right? So we're going to go through just an example, some best practices on making sure that the user can't get back into the system, making sure that all their stuff is cleaned up, and of course, making sure that you have backups of that stuff in case you need it, right? So first of all, we have the user leaving because, again, me and my creative naming mechanisms is John Doe. So the user J Doe is the one who's left the organization. Now, if I did an ID on J Doe, you'll see J Doe has an account. They're part of a supplemental group. And at the moment, that's as much as I know about them, because a good system probably doesn't remember every single user on every single system, but your Linux systems will be able to tell you a whole lot about these users. And that's part of what I'm going to go into in the critical path here, right? So I'm going to tell you that you probably want to jot down this user ID, because at one point after you've deleted the user, the system no longer knows who J Doe is. But lingering files that have that ID associated with them still have the same ID associated with them. And you're going to have to make sure that those things get cleaned up, right? And you'll see an example of that as we get toward the end of this after we've deleted the user. So first of all, a good first step is at the moment that this user is no longer employed by the company or whatever, they've been terminated or they've left on good terms, doesn't matter. The first thing you should do is lock the user account. Now, you could do this via a scheduled job, for example, maybe at 5 p.m. on that person's last day. It just happens. That way, no one has to remember to make this a thing. But usermod has a -L option, which is lock, and then you just give it the username of the person, right? So we do that. And now what that does is it makes it so the user cannot connect to the system anymore. Their account goes into lockout mode, which I think if we were to look at Etsy Shadow, we should now, no, I guess not. It must lock it in some other way. I thought it would put the bang bang in here, but it doesn't. It's retaining the password, it's locking it via other metadata along with the account.
Oh, so the account's it put an exclamation point at the beginning of
the I guess you are right. It put an exclamation point at the beginning of it, which the other user accounts do not. So there you go. That's how it does it. It puts the exclamation point, which basically means the password won't work, right? Like you try to connect to that account, it's not going to work. You're not going to be able to connect to that account. I don't know if root still could I still su dash over to this?
You're not authenticating.
Yeah, exactly. Because as root, I can do that sort of thing. Okay. So the account is locked out. The other thing that you may want to consider is checking to see if that account had any SSH keys and move or remove those as well. This user did not, but you would find them inside of a hidden subdirectory inside of the user's home directory called .ssh. And I can show you on root here. Oh, no, I guess root doesn't have any either. One of the accounts on here, maybe rel does. Nope. I thought I had an account here that had SSH keys, but you'll find it inside of a hidden subdirectory called .ssh. It's a file in there called authorized_keys. And if you just rename that file or empty the file out or delete the file, now that SSH keys aren't going to work anymore either. Okay, let's move on. The next thing we want to see, now that the account's locked out, we know nobody can connect to it. Let's see if that user has any files on this system that are owned by them. So we're going to use find. And if you remember, we had an episode a couple episodes back about all these trick things we can do with find. This was one of them, right? So remember that. So all this is going to do is find it and show us things that exist owned by this user. So I can tell you right now that this user has mail waiting for them. Maybe that matters, maybe it doesn't. Depends on the purpose of the system. Usually that's just system notifications and stuff that have come to the user. They've got a cron job. They've set up cron, right? Varspool cron JDoe means that there's a cron job that runs as this user. And of course, here's their home directory, right? That's something we'd expect to find. You can see there's a bin subdirectory with a shell script in there. That's important to note because things running out of people's home directories is exactly how that thing that always just worked suddenly stops working when John leaves the organization, right? And then, of course, we have a shared directory /shared. There's a subdirectory called JDoe. You know, maybe this is some shared user structure. Maybe it's a volume that's mapped in that has shared home directories on it. whatever. It's just an example here. You can see that inside of shared, we have a JDO subdirectory, and there's a file inside of there called businessy. So there's probably super businessy stuff in there.
So before you move on, one quick thing. I like that you used find, because I think typically when people think about users, they think about one location in their file system.
Their home directory.
Exactly. And, when we start talking about things like backing up somebody's stuff or whatever it is we're going to do with the user's data, everyone focuses on home directory. But using find, you found that there were all these files elsewhere on the machine, shared directory, var spool mail. So using find lets you find all of that stuff too.
Right, that it does. Now, the next thing that we can do with that data is you could lovingly handcraft a tar archive out of all that data, because you probably want to back up what this user had on the system, just in case, right? There could be cases where they had stored some data, and if you just blindly delete it, a month from now, you'd be like, man, John was the expert on that thing, and I don't know anything about it anymore. But maybe he had like documentation in his home directory, or maybe that shell script there was something really important. You can also use find and use the exec flag to append a tar archive with all the stuff that it finds. And I looked that up and made sure I got the right syntax before the show today. If we do a find, pointed at the root, look for user JDO, the same thing we did just before, but now we add an exec flag that uses tar with the right command line options to make a tar archive out of every file it finds. We hit that, and there you go. You can see a bunch of outputs saying it's removing, deleting the slash from file names. And now if I do an ls-l, for example, there we go. We have a tar archive of JDO. Now if I were to like make a temp directory here, go in there, xf./JDO, we should get all of JDO's stuff, right? You can see there's var, and you should find spool inside of there, and there's cron, right? So there's that cron tab that we said JDO was running. There's his home directory, right? There's that shared directory with JDO inside of it with his businessy file. So everything that you needed, everything that JDO owned is now inside of this tar archive. And now at this point, we can feel pretty safe that we can probably start doing things like removing JDO. But there is one more thing I suggest you check, and that is, did JDO have any sudo rules? Because they do not get automatically cleaned up when you remove JDO, right? And that may never be a problem, but you'll have this lingering sudo rule in there for a user that doesn't exist anymore. And if a new user named JDO ever gets created, which, by the way, could be something that you put into your user management policy. We never reuse usernames. But if you did, and all of a sudden another JDO, maybe a Jane Doe, starts with your company, and they get the same username because your naming convention would have named her JDO the same as John Doe was, she'd all of a sudden have the same sudo rule because it matches the username, right? So there's a subcommand for sudo called sudo-l that if you're a user and you do sudo-l, it'll show you all the sudo commands you're allowed to run. If I'm a different user, like root, for example, I can pass the -u flag to sudo and say, run sudo as this other user, and then do -l, right? So what this is going to tell me is, look at that. JDO is allowed to run ls as root. Why ls? I don't know. It was an example that I put in there. But the point is, now I can go look through sudoers and figure out why does JDO, what rule allows JDO to run ls. So if I just went to etc sudoers, I'll find that inside of there, there's a sub file. It's a file in the directory called JDO, and inside of there is a rule for JDO allowing them to run ls. Now, this could be inside of etc sudoers, in which case you could just cat etc sudoers, and you could find it in there. You could even use grep, just grep in etc for JDO as a search term. You could grep just the sudoers file, whatever, however you want to try to find this. But the point is, you've got a rule you have to track down and get it cleaned out. I don't know if there's a clean way to just ask sudo, tell me everything JDO can do and how they get the grant, but that might be something to look into as well. All right, so I'm going to remove that. sudo ers.djdo because Joe not going to work here anymore. And then we're going to remove jdo. Let's clear the screen so you guys can see better. So there's two ways to do userdel to clean up jdo. You could just do userdel jdo. And what that does is it'll delete the user entry for jdo, but leave the file structure in place. If that's your procedure, then fine, you can do that. But I can tell you what that's going to lead to is a lot of cruft inside of home. If you've already made an archive of the files like we did earlier in the critical path here, then I would suggest you use userdel-r and then the username for jdo. So give me just a sec here. We're going to paste that in there. Userdel-r tells userdel, yes, delete their home directory as well as the user, right? And that's probably good practice as long as you've made a backup of that. Now, if I did an ID on jdo, it's going to tell me that jdo doesn't exist. I don't know who that guy is anymore. If I look at home, the jdo user directory is no longer there. Does it remove cron? Let's find out. It did not remove the cron file for jdo. So that's something you're going to want to clean up.
Yeah, it only removes stuff in home.
I don't want to remove all of cron.
At your mail,
right.
This, those are things you would have to account for separately.
Right. So the other handy thing there would be we can use find to find everything that's owned by jdo again, and this time tell it to delete them.
Well, you've already removed the user though, so nothing's going to be owned by jdo anymore.
Yeah, right? This is my example that I alluded to earlier. So you might remember we deleted John Doe already. John Doe doesn't exist on the system anymore. Do we have John Doe's user ID? I didn't jot it down, but I think it was like 1014 or 1013. Actually, here's what we can do.
You could do it, yeah.
Remember that?
Cron.
On the shared directory. There we go. 1012 is his user ID. So that first column there, that's his user ID, and that's the group ID that owns it. So if we do the same find command, and it'll take the user ID, the number, as well as the user ID name. So we do 1012.
Before you do that,
I already did it. What's the matter?
Well, he's got all this stuff in shared. Maybe that's shared with other team members, and you've now just deleted a bunch of stuff that is important to their team. But thankfully, you have a tar archive. And you can
thankfully, I have a tar archive.
Woof. The other thing I would probably have done, instead of trying to look up jdo's user, I would have just used find with no user, the -no user option. Because that's going to
there you go.
Don't have a user owner, including the jdo files that we now have that aren't owned by a user account.
And that could be a good thing to do periodically anyway, because if you have files that are not owned by a user and they got missed by some other cleanup job, that'll help you find those too, which could be catastrophic or could be great. So pay attention to what you're deleting. All right. The only other thing, remember jdo was part of a supplemental group. If we do so let me clear the screen again here. What was it? Group mems -g, and then what was it? Some users I think it was capital L, or maybe it's just -L. Okay. So what that would do is it would tell you who's a member of this group, right? In this case, it's empty because jdo was the only one. Let's use, I don't know, wheel as an example. You can see that if I look up wheel, it tells me that rel is a member of wheel. I knew that was going to be true because we do that on these lab environments. So some users is now empty. So we could make a decision at this point. Does some users need to stay here because the next time we hire someone to replace jdo, do they get added to the some users group? Or is some users a group that was specific to jdo for some reason and we should now delete it? So this is a thing that's hard to do automatically unless you have some context around why was jdo part of that group and should that group persist anymore or not, right? So if you were going to remove it, it's groupdel, isn't it? Is the command. I didn't jot this one down. But groupdel and then the name of the group. We'll delete the group. And that's, I think, it. We've successfully cleaned up jdo. Did I miss anything? Anything good that people in chat were bringing up?
They were all making fun of you for deleting the files without checking them first.
Oh, well, I'm a very cautious systems administrator in all lab environments that have zero meaning to me.
We talked about this being a local user. A lot of companies and organizations will use a larger method for managing their
Yes.
accounts, right? Something like Active Directory or LDAP. So we showed you how to manage individual user accounts on individual boxes, but realize that the same things, like the user left, what do we do? How do we find their files? What do we do to archive them? All those same questions still need to be answered, even if you're using a central authentication model.
Right.
So,
Shantanu brought up a good suggestion: running processes for JDO. Was there anything running in memory for JDO? And we didn't check.
did not check, but you could PSAUX pipe into grep 1012 now, because that would be what they're running as now.
There shouldn't be anything. Oh, there's just the grep that's running 10.
Which, by the way, quick command line tip. If you recall that previous command and you put the 1 in 1012 in square brackets.
Just the 1, okay?
Yep.
Oh yeah, now it'll say things that start with 1012, right?
Well,
yeah.
Well, this will be the same thing. It'll find things that are contain 1012, but the grep no longer shows up because the grep is square bracket 1 square bracket 012.
Right.
So it doesn't match the regular expression anymore.
I actually ran across this while setting up a challenge. I learned about that exact thing that Scott just brought up because in one of the tests that I had to do to make sure a process was not running anymore, I kept running into a problem where grep was messing up my check.
All right. So all the things that we showed you are a whole bunch of tactical tasks that one would perform when doing management of a user.
Right.
But Nate, that was only users leaving.
We can certainly talk a whole lot about users being created too.
Yep. And then it also doesn't cover things like, what if somebody loses their password? How do they get that thing reset? And so this is where the policy piece comes into play. So that you can have standard ways of handling these situations. And because you've written it down in a policy, other people also know the standard ways that they are supposed to handle these situations.